The Knights of Labor advocated for worker cooperatives to make each man his own employer. They advocated for the abolition of child labor and the abolition of trusts and monopolies. The Knights favored settling labor disputes by means of arbitration rather than resorting to strikes. Because the Knights were loosely organized, however, Terence Powderly could not control local units, and those local units often decided to strike. The Knights of Labor grew rapidly and attained a peak membership of 730,000 workers by 1886. They declined just as rapidly, however, after the violence of the Haymarket riot in Chicago in 1886, because this really turned public opinion against the Union. Chicago had about 80,000 Knights in 1886, and it was the site of the first May Day labor movement. Also living in Chicago were about 200 anarchists who advocated the violent overthrow of all government. In response to the May Day movement calling for a general strike to achieve an 8-hour day, labor violence broke out at a Chicago harvester plant. On May 4th, workers held a public meeting in Haymarket Square and killed 7 police officers. The bomb thrower was never found. Even so, 8 anarchist leaders were tried for the crime, and 7 were sentenced to death. Horrified by the mob incident, many Americans concluded that the Union movement was radical and violent. The Knights of Labor was the most visible union at the time, lost popularity and membership. Unlike the reform-minded Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor concentrated on attaining narrower economic goals. They were founded in 1886 as an association of 25 craft unions, all led by Samuel Gompers until 1924. And then the AFL focused on just higher wages and improved working conditions. Gompers directed his local unions of skilled workers to walk out until the employer agreed to negotiate a new contract through collective bargaining. By 1901, the AFL was by far the nation's largest union, with 1 million members. Even this union, however, would not achieve major successes until the early decades of the 20th century. 2 massive strikes in the last decade of the 19th century demonstrated both the growing discontent of labor and the continued power of management to prevail in industrial disputes. Henry Clay Frick, the manager of Andrew Carnegie's Homestead steel plant near Pittsburgh, precipitated a strike in 1892 by cutting wages by nearly 20%. Frick used the weapons of the lockout, private guards, and strikebreakers to defeat the steelworkers' walkout after 5 months. The failure of the Homestead strike set back the union movement in the steel industry until the New Deal in the 1930s. Even more alarming to conservatives was the strike of workers living in George Pullman's company town near Chicago. Pullman manufactured the famous railroad sleeping cars known as Pullman cars. In 1894, he announced a general cut in wages, and he fired the leaders of the workers' delegation who came to bargain with him. The workers at Pullman laid down their tools and appealed for help from the American Railroad Union, whose leader, Eugene V. Debs, directed railroad workers not to handle any trains with Pullman cars. The union's boycott tied up railroad transportation across the country. A lot of railroad owners supported Pullman by linking Pullman cars to mail trains. They then appealed to President Cleveland and persuaded him to use the Army to keep the mail trains running. A federal court issued an injunction forbidding interference with the operation of the mail, and ordered railroad workers to abandon the boycott and the strike. And for failing to respond to this injunction, Eugene Debs and the other union leaders were arrested and jailed. The jailing of Debs and others effectively ended the strike. But then in 1895, the Supreme Court approved the use of court injunctions against strikes, which gave employers an even more powerful weapon to break unions. After serving a 6-month jail sentence, Debs concluded that more radical solutions were needed to cure labor's problems. So he turned to socialism and the American Socialist Party, which he helped to found in 1900. By 1900, only 3% of American workers belonged to unions. Management held the upper hand in labor disputes, with government generally taking its side. However, people were beginning to recognize the need for better balance between the demands of employers and employees to avoid the numerous strikes and violence that characterized the late 19th century. During the Gilded Age, industrial growth was concentrated in the Northeast and Midwest regions, the parts of the country with the largest populations, the most capital, the best transportation. As industry grew, these regions developed more cities and attracted more immigrants and migrants from rural areas, and created more middle-class jobs.